So last week, Moses and God's people were on the border of the promised land, just on the other side of the Jordan River, and Moses was giving God's people some last instructions before he died. Moses, of course, was not allowed to enter the promised land because, well, short version is he had anger issues. It's a little longer and more complicated than that, but that's the short version. Joshua, his apprentice, one of the two faithful spies from Numbers chapter 13, crossed over into the promised land and ended up conquering just about most of it. And before his death, he also, like Moses, left the people with a choice. Serve God or abandon God, and oh, by the way, this is what's going to happen if you do either. And the people all, of course, unanimously decided that they were going to follow God forever. And apparently, under their definition of forever, it means until Joshua died. Because as soon as Joshua died, the people rebelled against God and they turned to other gods. So God sold them to the king of Aram until Othniel, Caleb, who was the other faithful spy, his nephew, saved God's people. And God's people followed God until Othniel died, and then God gave them over to Eglon, the king of Moab, and they cried out for salvation, and God sent Ehud to free them. And they followed God until he died, and the process repeated until with Shamgar, Deborah, and Barak, Gideon, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and finally Samson. And after the train wreck that Samson was, there was an episode with some Danites and then some Benjaminites who took some liberties with the Levite's wife, and all in all, it showed just how far Israel had fallen into sin. And the book of Judges ends with this wonderfully hopeful message. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. And that's the environment that the book of Ruth is set in. The very first verse tells us that it happened in the time of the judges, this time of more or less lawlessness in Israel, when everyone did whatever they thought was a good idea. And it just so turns out, and I always crack up at this because I know a little bit of Hebrew, that there was a famine in Israel, and a guy and his family had to leave Bethlehem. Now, does anyone know what Bethlehem means? It's the house of bread. There is a famine in the house of bread, and I find that hilarious. The house of bread shouldn't run out of bread, but they did. And so, a man named Elimelech took his family and moved to Moab, where there was food. The sons grew up and got married, and over time, Elimelech and his two sons all died. Now, news got to Naomi that way back in Israel, the famine was over and there was food again. So she decided that she was going to go home and live out her widowedness with her own people. She tries to send both her daughters-in-law, both of them being Moabites and probably not being all that welcome in Israel, tries to send them home to find new husbands and a new family so that basically they can survive. One of them did, the other did not. Ruth refused and said instead she insisted that she return to Israel with Naomi, and that Naomi eventually gave in. Not sure what my words were doing there, but it definitely wasn't what my brain was doing. Ruth pledges to completely abandon her old life, even forsaking her Moabite gods, to return to Israel with Naomi. Now, I'd like to point out, in most commentaries about Ruth and Orpah, they always draw this massive contrast between this loyal and wonderful Ruth and this terrible, disloyal Orpah. And I think that's unfair to Orpah. Because if you really want to think about it, which of them actually did what Naomi wanted? Orpah, the one who went back home and listened to Naomi is just as loyal to Naomi as Ruth is. The difference is that one showed her loyalty to Naomi by following her instructions, and the other one showed her loyalty by sticking around. So Orpah really gets a bad rap here, and I don't like it. So anyways, Ruth and Naomi decide to head back to Bethlehem. Ruth ends up meeting a guy named Boaz, yada, yada, yada. King David is their great-grandson. That's about how the story goes. There's the entire book of Ruth in a sentence. There's two things, though, that are really interesting to me about this book. The first is that Ruth was willing to give up absolutely everything she knew to go and stay with Naomi. And the second, God shows up twice. Sure, he's mentioned here or there, but he only directly acts with three things. Two things. First, he ends the famine. The Lord brought food back to Israel. So that's the first thing that God directly does in the book of Ruth. The second thing is that he enabled Ruth to have a son. Those are the only two times in the book of Ruth that God is directly mentioned doing anything. The rest of the time he shows up as, the Lord did wrong by me, and Naomi and her, for lack of a better term, whining. You've got a lot of times where people greet each other in the name of the Lord. But those are the only two things that God does. Or is it? Because quite often through the book, you kind of get a sense of, it just so happened that something happens. It just so happened that Ruth was picking up the scraps of grain from the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happened to be the second closest relative to Elimelech that could go through the whole complicated process that whole complicated process is. It also just so happens that he thought Ruth was kind of cute. It also just so happens that the person who was the closest relative didn't really want anything to do with that. And he passed on all of Elimelech's stuff, including the women, because, as we've established many, many times, it wasn't a rough time for women back then. And so there's a whole lot of just so happens in the book of Ruth. Things that are a little bit too coincidental for my taste, without, of course, accounting for God working through those just so happens to bring about the thing that he was trying to bring about. And as Ruth was going about her life, I have to think that she was clinging to this promise that she made to Naomi, not just that she was going to leave her home, not just that she was going to follow Naomi, but she was also going to follow Naomi's God. Naomi's God also became Ruth's God, and of course is our God as well. And everything for Ruth just kind of seemed to go well. Not to say there weren't a whole lot of challenges along the way, namely being a widow in ancient times. And I think that's kind of how it tends to work out for us. There are many challenges along the way, but when we're following God, things just seem better. Even when bad things happen, as Paul so often writes, and Paul had a lot of things bad happen to him, he says, I know the secret of contentment, whether I'm in jail or free, whether I'm hungry or full, whether I'm this or that, I'm following God. And he finds joy in that, even when everything around him might be going wrong. Now, I have a particularly interesting story about a time when a whole bunch of coincidences conspired to get me to get on God's page. When I graduated from college, I had told God how things were going to be. I was going to get a real job, and then after a while, a very indeterminate while, I was going to become a pastor. But I was going to get a real job first and make, like actual income. I was an engineer. Seemed like a good idea at the time. But it just so happened that everything just about went wrong. It was odd. I had good grades. I knew what I was doing. But whenever I applied for a job, something went squirrely. Either the funding for the position fell through, or my skill set just precisely didn't match up with what they were looking for. It was weird. Then an even weirder thing happened, because finally, me getting a little bit fed up and my parents getting a little bit fed up, I decided that I better just apply to seminary. So I applied to Salt Lake Seminary, and then as soon as I did that, everything started going, right. About 2 days before the financial aid deadline, I was freaking out because I didn't have everything gathered together, and I get a phone call saying, just so you know, we moved the financial aid deadline back a month. So, well, that was nice. As soon as I got to seminary, I immediately found a part-time job. I walked through the door, and I was told that I was going to be working in the library for a while. And I was like, okay. That actually ended up leading to a second part-time job where I was working with the seminary's computers, which opened the door when I came back from my internship to get another, even better part-time job while I was finishing up my last year of school. Everything just worked once I finally shut up and got on God's page. When I started to actually pay attention to these things, and then when I was going through the book of Ruth, actually this is the book that we used to learn Hebrew from, so I kind of like this book. I have happy memories of this one. It made me realize that when we start to get on God's path until we stop trying to make God's path fit what we want to do, things just kind of go easier. If you look at Ruth's path, for example, even with its twists and turns, and she ended up, as I mentioned, being David's great-grandmother. And of course, being David's great-grandmother, that means that who else is her direct descendant? The son of David, Jesus. So I try to give you guys the Sunday school answers, and then maybe it'll work. Sunday school answers: God, Jesus, and the Bible. So one of those is usually right. Usually. So Ruth's story reminds us of the importance of following God, and that God is working for us when we follow him, even when those ways are not exactly obvious. The book of Ruth and the story of Ruth helps us to realize and remember that God doesn't always work in these obvious ways, and so that we can look for these subtle ways that God works in our lives and give thanks for them, even when the times that we have might be hard. To know that even when the world and the sin of the world is pressing down on us and not great things are happening, we can still trust that we have God on our side. We can still trust that even like Naomi, when everything fell apart around her, there is still good news. We've been going through the Old Testament prophets in adult Sunday school, and we've heard this message over and over again. There is going to be terrible times, but at the end, it'll get better. This is the good news that we have. In the end, it'll get better. No matter what's going on, when we look towards God, when we look towards the cross, that is the core of God's promise to us. It will get better. Because when we follow him, he does have our best interests in mind.